Hello students, this is Professor Del Russo, and a number of students had questions about the juvenile waiver process in New Jersey. Your readings describe the general waiver process and how it applies generally throughout the United States. I want to focus on how it works in New Jersey, and I touched upon this during our class lecture, and I want to clarify it and make sure that everyone understands it. It is a complex process, and this mini lecture does not describe all of the elements of it, but I do offer you the major elements for juvenile waiver. Now, the first thing that has to happen is the prosecution has to file some paperwork called a motion. And in that paperwork, they have to describe a number of factors in order to get a waiver. And by waiver, we mean a transfer of the case from the juvenile court to the adult court to be prosecuted and tried as an adult defendant. That paperwork has to be filed within 30 days of the juvenile's arrest. Now, when a juvenile is arrested, he's arrested on a complaint for an act or acts of delinquency. So within 30 days of the complaint being filed, the prosecution has to file the motion for referral. Once that's filed, here's how the rules unfold. For children between 14 and 16 years of age, they have to have committed a target crime, one of the crimes described on the list that you can see on this slide: criminal homicide, first-degree robbery, sexual assault, and others. If the prosecution can show that the complaint accuses you of one of these crimes, the next thing they have to do in a hearing before the juvenile court judge is demonstrate that there's probable cause, that the offense probably happened. And the way they do that is they typically put a detective on the witness stand who will testify as to the circumstances of the offense and the arrest. And cross-examination is allowed. The juvenile will have a lawyer, and the lawyer gets to question the detective. It's not a long process. It is summary in nature. That means it's a short process, enough so that the court is satisfied that there's a probability that the juvenile committed the offense. And the other thing the prosecution has to show is a little wishy-washy, that the public interest requires waiver. It seems that most of these offenses, it's easy to make that argument. Nevertheless, the prosecution still has to argue to the judge that the public interest requires this waiver to adult court. Now, all is not lost for the juvenile, because the juvenile can defeat waiver. The juvenile can avoid waiver if they're between 14 and 16, and they can show, the burden's on the juvenile, they can show the probability of rehabilitation before reaching the age of 19. And the way they do that is by showing that the services, procedures, and facilities available to the court will allow them to be rehabilitated by 19, and that probability of rehabilitation substantially outweighs the reasons for the waiver in the first place. So there is hope for juveniles 14 to 16. They can avoid waiver if they can show they can be rehabilitated before they reach 19. And the way that this happens in the courtroom typically is the juvenile will hire an expert, usually a psychologist, and that psychologist will conduct a risk assessment and conduct a number of psychological exams and look at the prior history of the juvenile, among other things, and come up with an opinion as to whether this juvenile can be rehabilitated before they reach the age of 19. Now, juveniles 16 and older, there are special rules, or I should say the rules change. Juveniles 16 and older do not have the possibility of defeating waiver by showing that they can be rehabilitated prior to reaching 19. And that's basically the only thing that's different. So children 14 to 16, if the government tries to waive that child to adult court, they can avoid waiver if they can show probability of rehabilitation by 19. But once you hit 16 and older, this factor cannot be relied upon by the juvenile. That means essentially the prosecution simply has to show that you're charged with one of those target offenses, that they filed the paperwork within 30 days, and that there's probable cause. Once the prosecution shows that, the judge will waive you to adult court for a criminal trial before a jury. And that is juvenile waiver in a nutshell.